Hi, everybody. It is your AP Biology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today, we are getting into topic 3.4 in the AP Biology curriculum on photosynthesis. This is one of the biggest topics that there is in all of the curriculum. In fact, in regular bio classes, photosynthesis might be a whole unit, but here it's just one topic, and there's a lot to cover. And I don't want to waste any more time, so I'm going to get into it right away because we have a lot to talk about here today. All right, so as you may already know from a previous biology class, photosynthesis is the process by which plants make their own food. Okay, they're able to make carbohydrates like glucose and other monosaccharides, which can be built up into polysaccharides using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide that they obtain from their environment. All right, it's makes them really special in the world of, well, living things, because they can take a non-living form of energy in the form of light and transform that energy, like we talked about in our last topic, into a form of energy that can be used by itself and other living things. So here's the formal definition. It's a series of reactions in plants and plant-like organisms that uses carbon dioxide, water, and energy from light to produce oxygen and carbohydrates that can be stored or used. So here we are, photosynthesis, your very simple graphic over here. It absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, water through soil or whatever other medium it gets water from. It releases oxygen into the air that we consequently breathe. We'll talk about that in the next topic. And it, of course, makes glucose, all right? And that can be used by the plant, or it can be stored as starch, or maybe converted into cellulose to build cell walls, whatever, all right? But the important thing is that it makes carbohydrates using energy from light. Now, here's a chemical equation that represents the overall process of photosynthesis. However, it is important to note, while this is a simplified representation of what photosynthesis looks like, if we were to put it in a chemical formula here, it's not just one reaction. It's a bunch of reactions going on. So what we're able to do is, once again, take at least 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules and use those to make a glucose molecule and some oxygen. But where does the energy come from in order to go from 6 smaller molecules into one larger molecule? You need light in order to do that, okay? And we're going to talk about how exactly that happens here momentarily. But light is the key factor here, and that is the source of the energy that's going to be used to make those bonds in those carbohydrates. Okay, before we get into the specifics of photosynthesis here, you got to know that first, green algae, which are protists, by the way, they're not plants, they're not bacteria, they are protists, they're eukaryotic organisms, single-celled eukaryotic organisms, and cyanobacteria, which are single-celled organisms, and they're actually prokaryotes, can also photosynthesize, all right? Actually, most of the oxygen that's produced in the atmosphere as of right now comes from these single-celled organisms, from algae and particularly cyanobacteria that's found in the ocean. We like to think of like the Amazon or the rainforest because it has so many trees being the lungs of the world, but really it's cyanobacteria that's floating around in the ocean. So cyanobacteria are in fact so important that photosynthesis first evolved in those single-celled prokaryotes, and they produced our oxygen-rich atmosphere. So our atmosphere is about 21% oxygen, and we can thank cyanobacteria for putting all that oxygen into the atmosphere. In fact, besides human beings, they are the organisms that have affected life on Earth probably the most. Out of anything that's ever existed, any form of life that's ever existed on planet Earth. All right, they're responsible for the oxygen-rich atmosphere, which is pretty cool. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics on photosynthesis. Now, it's going to get complicated here, all right, but I need y'all to listen. This is what I tell my students all the time. Keep your eye on the ball here, all right? Make sure we got the gist of this down before we get into all the specific mumbo-jumbo here and the nitty-gritty details about what happens, because it's going to get specific. We are going to get down to the molecular level and then some in order to understand how plants and plant-like organisms are going to be able to take light energy and convert that into bonds and carbohydrates. All right, so we can split up the process of photosynthesis into 2 main processes here. They're called the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. All right, we're going to be talking in detail about how the light reactions work today, in some detail about how the light reactions work today, but not necessarily the Calvin cycle. We do not have to memorize all the reactions in the Calvin cycle. You can save that for higher level college classes. But we do need to know the gist of what happens in the Calvin cycle. All right, so we're going to be talking a lot about this phase one over here with the light reactions and less about the Calvin cycle. But here's the overall view of how photosynthesis works. Ready? So in the light reactions, okay, this only happens in the presence of light. Okay, and what chloroplasts and plant-like organisms, plants and plant-like organisms are able to do with them is take water and make oxygen. Okay, and take water and make oxygen through that light reaction, so that we're going to look at here in just a little bit. So the oxygen that we breathe actually comes from a water molecule from a plant. Okay, that was reacted with using light. It was actually split. So light is used to make ATP and NADPH, which are two high energy molecules. ATP is the energy currency molecule, and NADPH is what we call a reducing agent. It's an electron carrier that can easily transfer an electron from one molecule to another. It's what's called a reducing agent. It causes what's called reduction reactions. Okay, so ATP and NADPH, these are high energy molecules that can be used to do other reactions, power other reactions. All right, and what reactions do they power? Well, they power the reactions in the Calvin cycle. And again, we don't need to know the specifics about the Calvin cycle, but what we do need to know is that what happens here is that a plant or a plant-like organism takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then uses the energy in the ATP and the NADPH to produce glucose molecules, all right, which are carbohydrates, high energy. They can be used for a whole bunch of different stuff, particularly cellular respiration, which is what we're going to talk about in our next topic. All right, so there's your overview of photosynthesis. Light reactions, Calvin cycle. Light reactions splits water into oxygen and makes ATP and NADPH using that light energy. And then those energy molecules are able to take carbon dioxide and put them together to form a glucose molecule. All right, so here's a definition of your light reactions in your Calvin cycle. Light reactions are coordinated metabolic pathways that can capture light energy to produce ATP, cellular energy, and NADPH, which is an electron carrier, or what's called a reducing agent. And as I just said, ATP and NADPH provide the energy needed for the Calvin cycle, okay? And then, consequently, the Calvin cycle are reactions that take carbon dioxide molecules and does something with them called fixes them. Carbon fixation is taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting them into a glucose molecule and link them in together to form carbohydrates using energy provided by ATP and NADPH. All right, so once again, I don't want you to take your eyes off of this. The goal here is to make glucose. All the other steps that are involved in photosynthesis and all the nitty-gritty details that we're about to get into with the light reactions here, the overall goal is for it to make glucose, okay? In plants and in green algae, we talked about these in our last unit. Chloroplasts, they're an organelle, a double membrane organelle that came from a photosynthetic prokaryote, right? We talked about that in our last unit. This is the site of photosynthesis. This is where photosynthesis occurs. And different parts of the chloroplast have different processes here, all right? It's, once again, highly compartmentalized, right? So these little Oreo-looking things, those are called, the disc shapes, those are called thylakoids, and that's actually what we're going to look at in detail here in a little bit. And a stack of these thylakoids, as you can see, they're kind of arranged in these stacks like a sleeve of Oreos, kind of. They're called grana. Or grana, I think it's grana maybe, but a granum is a stack of those thylakoids, and the light reactions, what we're going to look at in detail here in just a minute, happen on the thylakoid membranes. All right, so all of these membranes of these little discs here is where our light reactions are going to occur, and that's what we're going to look at here in just a second. All right, all the other space within the chloroplast is filled with a fluid called the stroma. All right, and the reactions that take place on the Calvin cycle, taking those carbon dioxide molecules and piecing them together into a glucose molecule, occurred there in the stroma. All right, the Calvin cycle is also referred to as the dark reactions because they don't require light in order for them to begin, right? They just require ATP and NADPH, which you get from the light reactions. Okay, so that's going to be important to know heading forward here. Okay, now before we get into the details, now this is a slightly more complicated version of what we're about to look at here for the light reactions. But what I need you to know is that the light reactions are going to use what's called an electron transport chain. All right, electron transport chain, an ETC. There's going to be another electron transport chain that we're going to look at in our next topic on cellular respiration, okay, to cause what's called photosphorylation. Okay, now before you freak out here, these are some big words that I'm throwing at you. Okay, photo means light. Okay, photography, photon, photosynthesis means light. Okay, phosphorylation. Okay, what does that sound like? Phosphorus, right? A phosphate group, what we looked at in our first unit. All right, phosphate groups in like nucleotides, for example. Okay, so basically, what's going to happen here is that we are going to see how a chloroplast is able to take a phosphate group and add it to an ADP molecule to produce ATP. Okay, and as we know, ATP is our energy currency molecule, right? It is the molecule that cells use to drive reactions or drive anything, any kind of cellular process, really. We looked at active transport. That requires ATP. We looked at that in our last unit. So how is it going to make ATP using light? That's what we're going to look at right now. And that's what's called photophosphorylation, and it uses what's called an electron transport chain. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you here momentarily. Okay, just one quick thing I want to show you here. What I mean by photophosphorylation here is just, I'm going to play that again. It's just the addition of a phosphate group from to an ADP molecule. ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate, di meaning two. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so all we're doing here is taking a low energy molecule of ADP, adding one more phosphate to it, and this bond right here between the second and third phosphate is very high energy, and the cell can use that for a whole bunch of interesting stuff. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here, phosphorylation, adding a phosphate to ADP to make it ATP, and ATP can be used for a whole bunch of interesting cellular stuff. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, this is our setup here. All right, we are along the thylakoid membrane. All right, so think about the chloroplast that we were just looking at. The membrane of one of those discs is where we are at here, and we have a whole bunch of proteins embedded into the thylakoid membrane over here. So what I put in light green is your, basically your lipid bilayer of your thylakoid membrane, and we have a whole bunch of proteins that are embedded into them. The important ones are the ones that I've located here, or that I've labeled here. Here's the stroma, so here's the outside of the thylakoid, here's the inside of the thylakoid, but we have photosystem 2, we have a proton pump, which we're going to see what that does in just a second. Another thing called photosystem 1, an enzyme called NADP reductase, and another super important, mega amazing enzyme called ATP synthase, all the way over here on the right side. So here we go. Ready? So how this is going to work. All right, photosystem 2, it's a protein complex. All right, there's two parts to it, and it contains a very important molecule called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a pigment molecule that actually makes all plants green. Now, plants are able to absorb energy from sunlight using this chlorophyll molecule. All right, so in these photosystems, there are protein complexes that also contain this chlorophyll molecule, and it's able to absorb a photon of light. And a photon of light is just a unit of light, right? It's like one piece of energy from light. It's a little more complicated than that, but don't worry about it. All right. So in photosystem 2, there's an electron. All right, and electrons, we don't have to get into all the chemistry and the physics of it. All right, but electrons are, they are the negative components of atoms, right? So here's the thing about an electron, though. When an electron absorbs a photon of light, all right, so the chlorophyll absorbs this photon of light in photosystem 2. When that energy is transferred to an electron, that electron enters what's called an excited state. All right, it kind of absorbs that photon of light, and it becomes excited, and then it can do that work. It gets boosted almost. It's like high energy electron now. Okay, and what's going to happen with that electron, all right, is that it's about to be transported across this membrane, across the proteins on this membrane through what's called an electron transport chain in order to get stuff done. All right, so this high energy electron in this excited state when it absorbs a photon of light is going to be able to, do some stuff. All right, now before we get into what that electron is going to do, let's talk about how that electron is replaced. Where do these electrons come from in the first place? Well, they come from water molecules. This is why plants need water. They need a source of electrons, essentially, to power these reactions, these light reactions. Okay, so water is actually going to be used up. It's actually going to be split. Remember, water is 2 hydrogen ions and 1 oxygen atom, right? So water is actually going to be split. An electron is going to be extracted from that water molecule, okay, and consequently some protons are going to be extracted from that water molecule too. Okay, so that electron, the hydrogen ions, the hydrogen atoms are taken off of that water molecule so that the photosystem 2 and the photosystem 1 consequently can have access to their electrons. All right, and by taking those electrons and protons away, what we're left with from that water molecule is oxygen gas. All right, so this is not balanced or anything over here, okay, but you get the idea, right? You take hydrogens away from water and you're left with oxygen. All right, so the oxygen that we breathe is actually kind of a byproduct, and this is not going to play another role in the light reactions going forward. It's almost like a byproduct, all right, to get that electron from that water molecule. Okay, so now that that electron is in a high energy state, it's passed along those membranes. I'm going to play that again. It's passed along those proteins in the membrane through what's called an electron transport chain. All right, so it visits kind of all these proteins that are embedded along this membrane and then gets transferred to photosystem 1. Now, what happens with that energy in that electron is that it powers this proton pump over here. And as it's so named, well, it's going to pump a hydrogen ion or a proton it's going to use some kind of active transport in a way, except it's not ATP that's being used, to put a hydrogen ion from the stroma into the thylakoid. Okay, so now we have hydrogen ions coming from splitting water, and we pumped in some hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid. Okay, so it's going against a gradient over here. We are building a proton gradient on the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so the energy from this electron is used to pump this hydrogen ion in. Now, what happens next is kind of amazing. You see what just happened there? All right, ATP synthase is actually a way for these protons to go back from the thylakoid back into the stroma. Now, we built, as I said, a proton gradient over here. There's more protons on this side of the membrane than there's on the other side. So naturally, they want to go back. Okay, so here they go, boop, 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 back onto the other side through basically diffusion, regular old diffusion because of that concentration gradient. But ATP synthase does something really cool. It is able to use the motion, use the force of those protons going from the high concentration to low concentration back into the stroma to phosphorylate ADP into ATP. All right, so using the energy from this flow of protons, it's able to transfer that energy into a bond to make that ADP and that extra phosphate, or what we call an inorganic phosphate, into ATP. All right, so we're not building ATP from scratch. We're just adding a phosphate to that ADP in order to make some ATP. So here's what what ATP synthase does. It's one of the coolest enzymes ever. It's an enzyme that phosphorylates ADP and an inorganic phosphate using energy from a concentration gradient of hydrogen ions, aka a proton gradient. And the word for this is what it's called chemiosmosis, right? Osmosis is the motion of water from high to low concentration of water, right? Chemiosmosis is using that flow of particles from a high to low concentration to get something done, all right? And that's what ATP synthase does. It uses the flow of these protons to phosphorylate ADP into ATP. All right, so now we have some ATP, okay, and our electron over here, a high energy electron, it used up its energy getting passed from one protein to the next to pump this proton, okay, but good thing that we have another photon of light, and we have another photosystem to re-excite that electron and bring it to another excited state once again. Okay, so now what's going to happen this time with the electron is that it's not going to get passed too far, but it is this high energy electron is going to get passed to this enzyme right here. It's called NADP reductase. All right, and NADP reductase is going to catalyze a reaction here using that electron. All right, to take NADP plus, okay, which is an electron carrier basically without an electron, and make NADPH with it. All right, so this electron is transferred over to this NADPH, and now this NADPH molecule is what's called a reducing agent. It can go somewhere else within the cell and transfer that electron in order to get some stuff done. And the thing that it's going to get done is, remember, it's going to power the Calvin cycle. It's going to power the fixation of those carbon dioxide molecules and put them together, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, into a glucose molecule here. All right, so here's our ATP and our NADPH. All right, I added some arrows here and I animated this step by step here, but the overall view is right here in case you want to draw this or put this down or whatever. But here we are once again. By absorbing photons of light, electrons can be used, electron transport chains can be used to not only phosphorylate ADP into ATP using a proton gradient, but it can also be used to reduce NADP plus into NADPH. And this electron carrier molecule and this high energy molecule are going to be used to power the Calvin cycle. So here's our two components that are going to be used to power our Calvin cycle. Take carbon dioxide and link them together into glucose. All right, here's the recap. Hopefully I covered everything, but in case you missed something or in case I missed something, here's what we talked about in this video. Photosynthesis, what it is, it uses light energy to produce carbohydrates using carbon dioxide and water. Photosynthetic organisms include plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, but photosynthesis first evolved in cyanobacteria, which are a type of prokaryote. All right, so photosynthesis first evolved in prokaryotes. In cyanobacteria, these prokaryotes produce our oxygenated atmosphere, all right, because of that splitting of that water molecule and that byproduct of oxygen being produced. That actually, happened so much that it produced the 21% of the oxygen, or the 21% of the atmosphere, which is oxygen. Photosynthesis involves two major processes, the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. The light reactions are what we just looked at in detail. They produce ATP and NADPH using energy captured from light by chlorophyll in photosystems, and they're located in the thylakoids of the chloroplast. Consequently, the Calvin cycle uses the energy from the ATP and the electron from the NADPH to fix carbon dioxide molecules into monosaccharides, namely glucose, right? So taking those 6 carbon dioxide molecules, bing, 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 and looping them together into a glucose molecule that the cell can consequently use. All right, and that is located in the chloroplast stroma. All right, the light reactions, what I animated here for you. Step 1, if we want to write it down here, step 1 is chlorophyll in photosystem 2 on the thylakoid membrane absorbs light energy, which boosts an electron to a high energy state. That electron is replaced by a water molecule, which is split to form hydrogen ions and O2, okay, oxygen gas, which is, kind of the byproduct. Then an electron transport chain begins where that high energy electron, excited electron, is passed along proteins in the thylakoid membrane and allows for the pumping of hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid, which makes a proton gradient. This proton gradient between the thylakoid and the stroma is used, all right? The hydrogen ions want to go from high to low concentration. The way for them to do that is go through ATP synthase, and that an ATP synthase enzyme uses the motion of those hydrogen ions to phosphorylate ADP and an inorganic phosphate and a P into ATP, and that's called chemiosmosis. The last couple steps here is that photosystem 1 re-excites the electron by absorbing another photon of light. The chlorophyll in photosystem 1 is able to absorb that light and transfer it to that photon of light and transfer it to that electron to re-excite it. All right, and then that electron, that excited electron, is passed to NADP reductase, another enzyme that's going to add a hydrogen ion and an electron to produce NADPH. And that NADPH is a reducing agent that's also used to power reactions. So here we go. Energy from the ATP and the reducing properties of NADPH powers production of carbohydrates in the Calvin cycle. Whew, that was a lot. All right, this is one of the biggest topics of all of AP Biology. This might be the longest video that we have all year. There's a lot to cover, so please, please, please let me know if you have any questions. It's a lot to go over. If you need to rewatch, go for it. But we will see you next time. We're going to talk about cellular respiration.